Hello students, this is the first day of our course Eco 600, that is Fundamentals of Economics. Now in this course we will cover 4 different modules. So today we start with module 1. Module 1 is about the fundamental principles of economics. So under fundamental principles, we will first start with talking about what is economics. So what does economics really deal with? What are the different branches of economics and how do those branches come together and work in coordination with each other? Now, as we talk about what is economics, now what is really economics as a discipline? Now, many textbooks will say that economics is a social science. Now that might be a new phrase for you because you may have heard about basic sciences and natural sciences like physics and chemistry and biology. So what is really the difference between a natural science and a social science? Let's compare with a course in natural science, let's say chemistry. Now in chemistry, if you go into a chemistry lab, you will see there are different chemicals, different reagents, salts, acids, and if you run a chemistry experiment, you're really working with these different salts, acids, and putting them together. Now I'm not a chemistry expert, I'm not a chemistry person, but I know that you put these salts and acids stuff together and you see what is the reaction and you draw your inferences based on that experiment. You say, okay, I put together salt 1, certain proportion, salt 2, this proportion, certain acid in this proportion, and this is what I saw. And you note down your observations based on this. So basically you have a precise idea of what you added and what you really saw after adding them in together. Right? And sometimes there might be something more sophisticated as controlling the temperature or controlling the pressure or using a special equipment for running the experiment. Now in a social science like economics, we really do not have a laboratory. Our laboratory is the society itself and the people living in the society are the reagents. And we give a special name to these reagents, as in the people like you and me living in the society, we call them the economic agents. So in economics, we are talking about economic agents and based on the functions performed by these economic agents, based on the role taken by these economic agents, we can further divide them into 2 groups, that is buyers or consumers, sometimes also called demanders, and the second group or sellers, sometimes called producers or suppliers. So in economics, we are really dealing with the society as a whole and we are dividing the people living in this society into 2 groups, that is buyers and sellers, and these 2 groups taken together are known as economic agents. Now, once we have these people in economics, we are really studying the behavior of these individual economic agents, and further we are studying the interaction of these 2 groups of economic agents. So if you really had to compare economics with a natural science like chemistry, then you could consider the buyers and the sellers as reagents and you could look at their interaction as an experiment, and whatever comes out as the result of those interaction is what we are really interested in. So in that sense, economics is a social science. So society is our laboratory and the people living in the society are our reagents. Now, why are we even looking at the behavior of these economic agents and why are we so interested in the interaction of these economic agents? The reason being that economics is a study of decision making. It really wants to see how people make their decision, not only at the individual level, but as a family, as a neighborhood, as a city, as a state, as a country, and then globally. So those are the different levels of decision making. But economics is really interested with how and why this decision making takes place at these different levels of the society. So simply put, we could say that economics is a social science which looks at choice making or decision making. That is the fundamental subject matter of economics, right? So from this very description, you can understand that, economics should be something that should interest everyone who lives in society, because it is about us. We are getting to know about how we make our own decisions, how we make a decision as a family, how we make decisions as a country, and how our own decisions affect someone who is living in close proximity with us. For example, another family member or someone in my peer group or someone living in the same state. So it seems like economics is something that should interest everyone. In fact, as a side note, I would like to mention that whenever I have advisees in my office, freshman year students at Missouri State, they come to my office and they still have undecided majors. They do not know, they are still considering whether they should do economics. And the common question they ask me is, why should I study economics? And my answer to them is, well, if you study economics for 4 years in college, you're just going to be a better citizen, if not anything else. You're going to be a worthy citizen of your country, leave alone the great career prospects that you have in economics. So on that note, let's move on to the next part, which is we are going to talk about the branches in economics. Now, I could divide economics really into two branches, that is micro and macro. So microeconomics and macroeconomics. You guys are lucky because in this course we are not specifically going to talk about a certain branch of economics. Rather, we are going to talk about the two branches. We are going to talk about some micro concepts and we are going to talk about some macro concepts, which will give you an opportunity to understand how they work in coordination with each other. But before we get there, let us first understand what is microeconomics and what is really macroeconomics. So micro, as the very name suggests, it means small. So in microeconomics, we are looking at decision making of the smallest unit of the society, which is basically an individual, right? So if I look at the decision making of one person, right, that is microeconomics. Or if I look at what is happening in the market for one particular commodity, that comes under the premise of microeconomics. So microeconomics is basically looking at the decision-making process at the level of the smallest unit of society, which could be an individual. Now remember, this individual could be a buyer or a seller. That's a different question. We could be looking at things from the buyer's perspective, or we could be looking at things from the seller's perspective in microeconomics. But as long as we are doing it from the perspective of one particular individual, it comes under the premise of microeconomics. Now, the name macro suggests that big, it is big. We are dealing with something big. So macroeconomics is basically looking at that same decision-making process, but in a bigger picture. That means we are no longer worried about one individual, we are no longer worried about one economic agent, but we are looking at all economic agents coming together and their decision-making process as a whole. We are not looking at one commodity, but we are looking at all different goods and services that are produced in a country. So basically, micro is a small, minuscule picture. It's a bird's eye view, whereas macro is basically the big picture of something. Nevertheless, they are both talking about the decision-making process. just the level and the scale are different. Now you could ask me that how do they work in coordination? Well, there's a lot of connection between micro and macro because every micro really builds the macro. If you consider a house to be the macro, then every brick that builds the house, every plank of wood that goes into building the house, that's the micro. So you must understand micro to understand macro. And once you have the macro picture, it does influence the micro picture also. Now let me elaborate a little bit on that. For example, you may be having a business, a new business, and you work on your business for 6 months, but you're not really seeing great results. You're not making great profits, and you start blaming yourself that, well, you know, I'm not a good business person. I'm not a good businessman, and hence my business is flopping. Well, it might be true. It could be because of micro factors. Maybe really you are not cut out for business. You're not a businessman material, and you did not have a great idea to start with. But there might be some macro reasons also. For example, maybe your business is in a country that is really not congenial for new startups. Or maybe the business policies, the government policies in your country are really not conducive for having a great business. Or maybe it is just a bad economic time in your country and every small business is failing during that time. Similarly, think about, you know, when you do not get a job. You graduate out of college with a finance degree thinking that you are going to walk out of college with an investment banking job, and then you try for 6 months, 1 year, and you do not land a job. And you start cursing yourself, and you go back saying, well, I'm the loser, I'm not getting a job. Maybe my decisions to study finance was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. Well, in some cases it might be true. Maybe you are not a good interview, you are not good at interviewing with a company, or maybe you are not taking the right process of applying for a job, or maybe you don't have a great resume. Whatever it may be, it could be due to micro factors, factors that are individual level, but it could also be due to macro factors, as in maybe during that time there's a recession in your country and just that jobs are not available, or hiring is really slow. Now when you take your decision, when you decide whether you should kind of wait for that investment banking job or take up any job that comes your way, you are specifically concentrating on the micro factors. You are not able to see the macro factors. You are only concentrating on what you get to see at the individual level, which is very obvious. Whenever we take a decision, we are just bothered about our own characteristics, how our own factors can affect our decision making. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there is always a macro perspective which may be affecting your micro decisions. Now, we may not always be aware of this macro perspective. We may not always realize that there is a macro big picture, but there is indeed a macro big picture that is influencing the micro decision making. In other words, there is something happening at the bigger level, at the macro level, at the level of your country, at the level of the entire world, in the level of the global economy, which is really influencing your individual decision making. You might be oblivious to it, but it is there. So that is really the coordination between micro and macro. And thankfully in this course, we will have ample opportunity to see how the two work together. Now in the first videos, in the first few videos, we will be talking about microeconomics, and gradually we will move towards macroeconomics, and then I will probably, connect the dots and kind of bring the two branches together. Now, besides these two divisions, that is micro and macro, there can be another division of modern economics, and that division is positive economics, sometimes also called the positive approach in economics, and the normative economics or normative approach in economics. Now, it's quite simple to understand the difference between two. Now, please let me kind of give you a disclaimer that positive and normative could be micro or macro. So, it is not really micro or macro specific. These are just two approaches of looking at economic phenomena. So, positive economics really looks at the question of what is. So, it is based on facts and evidence, and it is clearly measurable, and it is something that is very objective. Whereas on the flip side, normative economics really talks about things and refers to the question what should be or what ought to be. So you can understand from the description that it is subjective. It is not based on facts. Rather, it is based on value judgment, on individual perspective, and it is rather prescriptive. Now, let me give you an example to kind of bring out the difference between the two. For example, if I say that the Affordable Care Act, which is more commonly known as Obamacare, mandated universal health insurance for all US residents. That's a fact. Right? You can go back, you can look at the policy paper, and you can see that that is exactly what the Obamacare policy said. So that would be a positive economic statement or a positive economic phenomena. Now I could say in the same thing in the normative way, and I could say that, well, healthcare is a right and not a privilege. So the government should provide healthcare to all its citizens. Now that is a value judgment, right? There may be a policy which really sanctions that, a policy that mandates that, or may not be a policy that ratifies that. The government may agree to it, may not agree to it. So this is like a prescription. It's like an opinion that I am putting forth, correct? Similarly, let's say if I say that in 2017, the unemployment rate in Bolivia was 3.4%. And there was no change from 2016 in the unemployment rate. That's a fact. You can go back, you can Google, and you can see that that is correct, right? However, if I say that it is good for a developing country to contain its unemployment rate below 4%. Now that's a judgment statement again. It's not something embedded in reality. I am just giving a prescription for a country. It could be true, may not be true. Once again, it is good for these two approaches to come together in the case of decision making, more specifically decision making by the government, that is policy making. If the government is thinking about any policies, it is important for them to kind of know what should be, what is right, what is fair, and then kind of bring in the positive approach and do the steps, take the real steps based on those goals that are set. So let's say this is the ground reality and this is really the goals. So normative sets the goals while positive tries to achieve those goals in reality. Now with this we have come to an end with the subject matter of economics and the branches of economics. Next we are going to move on to the first set of principles of economics. Once again, those principles are irrespective of micro or macro. Those are the fundamental principles. They form the bedrock of micro and macroeconomics. And we will start with the principles of choice.